Hey there, HMS modelers. My name is Josh Willis, and I'm with the Corps of Engineers. This lecture will cover subbasin characteristics, which became available starting with version 4.6. The subbasin characteristics can be accessed by clicking Parameters, Characteristics, and Subbasin. Now, before you can do this, I do want to mention a few prerequisites. Before subbasin characteristics are available, you'll need to do two things. First off, you will need to make sure that your HMS model has georeferenced subbasins. And secondly, within the GIS menu, the pre-process drainage step has to be completed. Now, I'll also take this a step further, and I'll recommend that you pre-process sinks, pre-process drainage, and also do the identify stream step prior to computing subbasin characteristics. If your terrain model has sinks, this will affect the longest flow path calculations, which in turn can lead to some squirrely subbasin characteristics computations. This slide lists all the subbasin characteristics that are currently computed in HMS. The first time that you access this table, all of these characteristics for each of your subbasins will automatically be computed on the fly. The table is editable, so if you wanted to, you could come in and manually change some of the computed values. Now let's say that you come to this table for the first time and gosh darn it, you realize that you forgot to fill sinks. Or maybe you decide you want to go back and change your identify streams threshold. Well, there's no worries there. You could go back to the GIS menu, make those changes, come back to this table, and then recompute. And that will recompute all these characteristics based on the latest data that's available. Longest flow path length. This is a measure of the length that water travels from the most hydraulically remote point in your subbasin all the way down to the subbasin outlet. This length is significant in that it is typically used to determine the time of concentration for a watershed. The longest flow path slope can be defined as the elevation difference of the most hydraulically remote point and the subbasin outlet point divided by the longest flow path length. All right, let's talk about centroidal flow path. Centroidal flow path, as you can see in the image here, is shown in red, and then longest flow path is shown in blue. The upstream end of centroidal flow path starts at the point nearest the subbasin centroid and then traverses all the way down to the subbasin outlet. The centroidal flow path slope is simply the elevation difference from the most upstream point and downstream point divided by the length of the centroidal flow path. 1085 flow path is also a subset of the longest flow path. In the graphic here, if you think of the subbasin outlet as point 0 and the most hydraulically remote point as 100, then the 1085 flow path extends from the 10% location to the 85% location. The 1085 slope is simply the elevation difference between these 2 points divided by the length of the 1085 flow path. If you're like me, you might be thinking, well, why do we have all these different types of flow paths and slopes? Well, they each tell us something a little different about a subbasin. For many subbasins, the longest flow path slope represents a very steep slope that may not be indicative of the typical flow path slopes within a subbasin. Over here on the right, you'll see that we have a profile view of a longest flow path. And up near the basin divide, it does get quite steep. So your longest flow path slope may be steeper than the slope that you see along the majority of the path. Whereas with centroidal and 1085 slopes, they're usually more representative of the typical slopes found along flow paths. Empirical equations have been developed for specific regions of the U.S. and for specific subbasin types that use a variety of lengths and slopes to estimate subbasin parameters such as lag time or time of concentration. In another video, we'll talk about how you can use some of these different flow path lengths and slope calculations to quickly initialize parameter estimates in your HMS model. All right, basin slope is simply the average slope of the entire subbasin. So the algorithm looks at each elevation cell within a subbasin and then scans the surrounding 8 neighbor cells. It computes a slope using the maximum scanned elevation difference. And then at the very end, after it's repeated this process for each cell, it takes an average. This slide provides a more visual way of thinking of basin slope. The GIS workflow that you see in this figure is covered more in a different video, but in a nutshell, it starts with a digital elevation model from which flow direction and flow accumulation grids are computed, and then finally a stream network. And basin slope can be thought of as the average slope of all of these arrows that you see in the stream network part of the figure. Basin relief is a simple one. It's the highest point on the drainage divide minus the outlet elevation. In this simple example, the basin relief would be about 100 feet. The relief ratio is based on 2 prior characteristics that we have already discussed. It is the basin relief divided by the longest flow path length. The elongation ratio of a subbasin is just a way to describe a subbasin's general shape. So if you were to imagine a circle that has the same area as your subbasin of interest, the elongation ratio would simply be the diameter of the circle divided by the length of your subbasin. And in HMS, it uses the longest flow path length as an estimate of subbasin length. An elongation ratio close to 1 would indicate a perfectly circular subbasin, whereas an elongation ratio of, let's say, 0.2, well, that would indicate an elongated subbasin shape. Lastly, we have drainage density. This is a metric that describes how well a subbasin is drained by stream channels. It is the total length of all of the stream channels within a subbasin divided by that subbasin area. And the basic premise is that the higher the drainage density value is, the more efficient your subbasin is at draining a rain event. Now, as discussed in a previous video, the identify streams threshold is something that is defined by the user. And since this threshold directly impacts the total length of defined stream channels, it also has an impact on the computed drainage density values. So just keep that in mind. In fact, if you haven't computed identify streams as part of your GIS workflow, then when you compute subbasin characteristics, the drainage density values will return as 0. So just keep that in mind as well. Well, that is all she wrote for subbasin characteristics. Thanks, folks.